Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I'm with Nirupama Rao, former Foreign Secretary, former ambassador to China, and somebody who knows the line of actual control between India and China, the more than 4,000 kilometer long boundary between our two countries. Mr. Rao, welcome to ThePrint.
Thank you, Jyoti. Happy to be here.
Now, we are talking in the wake not just of the border standoff between India and Chinese soldiers in the Ladakh sector along the LAC, the line of actual control, but also in the wake of both sides, both India and China, dialing down in the wake of this standoff, promising now to talk again, to restart diplomatic conversation, and also US President Donald Trump offering to mediate between the two countries. What do you make of all these sort of diplomatic posturing, if you like, that's taking place?
Well, it's true that the situation along the line of actual control, particularly in the western sector, in the Ladakh sector, has been somewhat tense, if one is to believe and go by media reports, in the last few weeks, since the beginning of May. And there's been a lot of speculation about why this should have happened, what could be the underlying motive from the Chinese side, what is the reason that these differences persist, and finally, how are we going to diffuse this tension? How are we going to, as you said, dial down the tension? And in the meantime, you've had this tweet from President Trump. He speaks of a raging border conflict.
He always makes it more interesting, doesn't he?
So, that really presents it in a rather alarmist way that, India and China are at each other's throats, literally, and there is a conflict that is escalating in this. And he's offered to his good offices to mediate between the two. But, that tweet, putting aside the tweet, obviously India and the United States are natural allies. They are strategic partners. And the outgoing acting Assistant Secretary of State, Ambassador Alice Wells, said last week, she somehow seemed to connect what was happening along the line of actual control between India and China with China's rather muscular, assertive actions in the South China Sea. And she alluded to a kind of a pattern of such activities as if there was an underlying scheme of things as far as the Chinese were concerned. I'm not discounting that theory at all, but the fact is that along the line of actual control between India and China, there have been persistent, reoccurring transgressions over the years. Now, this particular sector, the Galwan sector, or subsector of the Ladakh sector of the line of actual control, has been relatively quiet in recent years. And one of the reasons for the alarms that have been raised is why should this sector have come alive? And there have been reports that the Chinese have crossed over into our side of the line of control, as we interpret it.
So first of all, do you think that these transgressions have taken place, that Chinese soldiers have entered into Indian territory? Or is it because that both countries have different perceptions of the line of actual control?
See, on the surface of it, obviously the Chinese patrols have come over to what we perceive as our side of the line of actual control. So that's, as things as they are. But there is, of course, a history to this, not only the differences in perception of the line of actual control, but this area saw fighting during the 1962 conflict. There was a battle fought at Galwan. Incidentally, Galwan is one of the few places along the line of actual control that doesn't have a Tibetan name. You have places like Chang Cheng Mo, for instance, which is so Tibetan sounding. Or you have names in the Aksai Chin that have a distinct Uyghur kind of ring to them, Shahidullah, even, of course, Kashmiri ring to them. Obviously, this whole belt is so linked through history. Ghulam Rasul Galwan was an explorer, who did a lot of, he trekked in the area, and he, in many ways, mapped the area in the 19th, early 20th century. So that's the history of Galwan. But there is a difference obviously, there is a difference in perception of the line of actual control in numerous pockets along the LAC, as we call it. And not only in the Western sector, but also in some pockets of the Eastern sector.
But why is it that India and China, we fought a border conflict in 1962, that's over 50 years ago. Why is it that you still haven't been able to demarcate this line?
The two big Asian countries with very rich histories and civilizations, and with very conscious definitions of what they are, who they are, what their territory is, how they define sovereignty. I mean, both of us are countries like that. And there are territorial claims from either side.
Are you talking about Aksai Chin?
I'm talking of Aksai Chin, where India is concerned. The Chinese have a claim in Arunachal Pradesh. Not that either side recognizes these claims, and there is a status quo, and there is a reality that has developed in the border areas in the last, let's say, since independence, or since since the setting up of the People's Republic. So that's the reality we deal with. And each side, of course, claims this territory as based on tradition, on custom, on natural features, on actual occupation, administration, governance. So it's a very complicated issue, and it has therefore taken time to resolve. And it's one of the largest territorial conflicts in the world, I would say, land border. So it hasn't been easy to resolve, but I think we must recognize that we've held the peace on this border, at least in an unbroken way, since October of 1975, when the last incident involving loss of life took place at Tulungla in Arunachal Pradesh, in the eastern sector of the India-China border.
So tell me, Ms. Rao, there have been over the years, since 1960 actually, when then Chinese Premier Zhou EnLai came to India and put forward what reports call, within quotes, a peace deal. So tell us what that was about.
Well, Premier Zhou EnLai came to India in April 1960 against a background of escalating tension between India and China relating to differences over the border. Right. And as you know, in the early 50s, the two countries had drawn close to each other. They had...
the whole Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai era.
No, even before that, in 1954, in April 1954, they signed an agreement on trade between India and the Tibet region of China, as they called it at that time, in which the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which later came to be known as the Panchsheel, were defined. So everybody spoke of, that agreement as having settled, I quote, settled things between India and China. Looking back, one can judge whether that was the right decision on the part of India to have really agreed to settling the whole question of Tibet with China. As you know, the status of Tibet had been called into question before that, and especially because the British, when they left the country, they had certain privileges in Tibet, which India had inherited. And the agreement of 1954 kind of did away with those privileges that India had, and India recognized Tibet as a region of China, and we spoke of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. And we assumed, without raising the question of the border or the question of the McMahon line with China, we assumed that everything had been settled because the Chinese had not anyway raised it with us, and we decided not to raise it either. So lesson 1 in diplomacy, I think, for everybody from this particular experience is that don't leave anything for second guessing, or don't assume to read between the lines. In diplomacy, there's no reading between the lines.
Would it essentially mean that India would keep the territories under its control and China would keep...
No, I don't think. Again, no second guessing here, no reading between the lines. But I think what he was saying is, let's observe the line of actual control as it exists today, to which our troops have come, or our administration extends. Let's keep that in the line of immediate vision, right?
Right.
So don't cross it. We observe peace based on that line. And let's try and settle the boundary, even although we have differences, based on certain principles, whether they're natural features, watersheds, mountains, river valleys. He used mountain passes, highest watershed, river valleys. He used all kinds of these things and maintained the line of actual control while we're discussing this. And that respect the sentiments of the people, whether it's the Indians towards the Himalayas or the Chinese towards the Karakorums, as he put it. So he had this set of ideas that he wanted to. He did discuss with Mr. Nehru, the Prime Minister, and many of his cabinet members, including V.K. Krishna Menon. The V.K. Krishna Menon papers, as you know, have become now public. They were closed until last 2 years ago, I think, or last year. And today we can read those records, that what was being discussed. So a lot of information has now come into the public domain. I remember when I first started dealing with this, the India-China relationship in the mid-80s, nothing was there in the public domain. But today the amount of information that has come into the public domain should allow us as concerned citizens to really assess and analyze this history and to draw the right conclusions and lessons from it, let's say.
Right. So that was the first so-called proposal from the Chinese premier. And then later on in the early 80s, you have Deng Xiaoping making another proposal on the boundary dispute. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, Mr. Deng Xiaoping, Chairman Deng Xiaoping, as he would be called those days, the reformer. He opened up China to the world, literally, and he's remembered in China as as a man, an epic kind of leader. At least he is. The Chinese look at him that way. But he basically was, in a sense, it was a variation on the theme of the Zhou EnLai proposal. Let's say he also was talking about the Indian side looks at the Western sector as the area of difference. Chinese side looks at the Eastern sector as the area of difference. But let's try and see how we can settle this based on essentially keeping in mind that there is a reality that has emerged in the border areas, and that we should keep that in vision, as it were, when we are discussing a settlement. He didn't really say we should, we'll settle your claim as far as the Eastern sector is concerned, that you keep what you have and we keep what we have. I don't think he was really saying that. We never got to discuss this. Bluntly, it was never discussed at the official level between the two sides. I mean, we didn't go to the Chinese and say, look, you've said this, your leader has said this. What exactly do you mean by this? It's always good to pin them down, and ask them to spill the details, literally. You can't, I mean, it cannot be like a Tang dynasty poem, or a haiku with 3 lines that you kind of just extrapolate on that basis and kind of construct a whole definition of what a negotiating strategy could be. So I don't think you can really pin them down. They're very astute that way, the Chinese. They've wriggled out of so many previous positions in this way. Or they're very ambivalent or very elliptical, or very putting forward very sparsely worded formulae when it comes to a settlement. So I think there's a lot to learn from that experience that we've had with them in the past.
But reports do suggest that just as India wants in the Western sector, the Aksai Chin territory and the boundary does, is drawn according to that. In the Eastern sector, the Chinese would like to take Tawang.
Again, all this is speculation. I mean, obviously, the Chinese.
But do you think that that's a concession that they would?
Yeah. Well, the Chinese have a bee in their bonnet about Tawang. I mean, I think that's more or less clear when you read all the commentary and the analyses that come from the Chinese side, from their experts and from their retired officials and retired PLA generals and what have you. And when they talk about the 1962 conflict on their side, there is an undercurrent, let's say, of criticism and regret. I'm saying from the Chinese point of view, that in 1962, they came into a large swath of territory in Arunachal Pradesh and then just withdrew, particularly in the Kameng sector, as it's called, where Tawang is. They came, almost the foothills and then withdrew. So, one wonders what the stratagem was at that stage. Was it just to teach India a lesson, as Deng Xiaoping famously is reported to have said, or whether they had come to the conclusion that it was unsustainable to keep that presence, or whether they were worried about their differences with the Soviet Union, or whether they were concerned that the United States would come to India's defense. God knows, whatever it is, they withdrew from that territory. And that really is the final note on that. I mean, I cannot conceive of that ever happening again. I don't think that can ever happen. If China and India want to build a long-term relationship, a partnership, or a relationship based on, this is that important principle that was mentioned in the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence: equality and mutual benefit. And the other thing, when it comes to
but can I just stop you right there? When you say equality and mutual benefit, are you indicating that the Chinese do not look at India as equals?
Well, do the Chinese look at any country as their equal, is the question. I think, I'm just speaking frankly and as a citizen now, not as a retired official. But the Chinese have a history of dealing with foreigners in a certain way. I mean, foreigners in Chinese history, if you read Chinese history, particularly history from the Qing dynasty or from the Yuan dynasty or even the Mings, the foreigners came to them paying tribute always. It was that the emperor was, literally the son of heaven. And they ruled this whole, everything under heaven, Tian Xia, as it's said in Chinese, everything under heaven, which, they saw was really maintaining that balance and that stability because of the equanimity and the benevolence of the Chinese emperor, literally. So that kind of attitude doesn't go away. It's part of a national psyche, I think. It doesn't matter if today they're ruled by the Chinese Communist Party. They're very imbued, I think, in that tradition of, being there because they are there essentially because they are there. The rest of the world is helped, literally. The rest of the world benefits from that presence of the Chinese. When it comes to treating nations as equals, there is an inherent, I think, there is an inherent barrier there, I think, in their psychology. Although, diplomatic language is, worded and crafted in the way international diplomatic language is worded and crafted. So to answer your question, and when it comes to India, they see us, of course, as a large neighbor, as a great civilization. Some Chinese say India conquered China without firing a shot, which means that Indian culture and Indian civilization and Indian religion in the form of Buddhism went to China and, essentially converted a whole people to this envisioning of this neighbor to the West. India is called sometimes in Chinese tradition as the Western heaven. Or there's a famous Chinese epic of the Monkey King called Journey to the West, and the West is India, really. So that feeling is there. But in today's world, in the contemporary world, they see India as having chosen the democratic path at the outset when they chose the communist path. And here we are, we've governed this big continent-sized country with a population as large as theirs through democracy. And we're a stable, united, even if we're chaotic and messy as they see us, and we have some way to go to become fully developed. But this is the other experiment, which has shown the rest of the world that there is another big Asian country that, can, in the long run, and has the potential to be a complete match for China as in terms of comprehensive national strength, as it were. So there is this inherent competition and rivalry, but also a feeling that India hasn't really got to the level where China is today because their GDP is 5 times our GDP, when 30 years ago we were at par with each other. Their military budget is so much larger. But taken, in terms of a global image that each country has, I don't think India really lags behind China in any way.
Mm. But you were telling me once about this lovely anecdote about the Olympic Games in 2008 when you were ambassador in China. So tell us about that. When
The other thing is how they have this iron brother relationship with Pakistan, as you know, and it's a relationship that really grew out of the differences between India and China just at the time of the border conflict. Because all through the 50s, Pakistan was just another country as far as China was concerned. They had a relationship with Pakistan. Zhou EnLai went there for the first time in 1956. Their leaders had met at Bandung. But, the relationship with India had much more traction and was far better textured than it was with Pakistan. It was only at the time when our differences over the border came into the open, and the Pakistan obviously saw advantage at that time to open channels with China, and they came to an agreement, as you know, a so-called agreement on the China-Pakistan boundary, where some of territory that we claim in Jammu and Kashmir was given up to China.
The Shaktam Valley.
Yeah, exactly, and in that region, and where India has a claim. And then the rest is history. Of course, they built a very strong relationship thereafter. And each successive Pakistani prime minister or president has cemented that relationship, let us say. So the Olympic event that I referred to was at the time of the inauguration of the Beijing Olympics in August of 2008. And I was there at the ceremony. I was ambassador in China those days. And as the contingents of each country marched into the Olympic stadium, it was 90,000 strong stadium, and it was full, and there was so much pageantry and mind-boggling splendor, the way they had pulled it out. The Chinese are masters of spectacle, as you know. And therefore, each contingent would come in, and when our contingent came in, the Indian contingent, there was a round of applause, very polite applause. It just went by. Nobody really took much notice. But when the Pakistani contingent came in, as an Indian, I couldn't but notice that. The whole stadium, erupted in a round of cheering and applause, which was distinctly different from what reception our contingent had got. Now, I'm not saying that really one can extrapolate on that basis that there's a theory of how the Chinese look at Pakistan and a theory of how the Chinese look at India. But the fact is, at the popular level, today, a whole generation has grown up learning or being taught that China and Pakistan are very close friends and brothers, and that with India, you have issues like the presence of the Dalai Lama, and you have the Tibetan refugees here, and you have the India-Pakistan rivalry, and that India somehow has to be contained for that reason.
So last couple of questions to come back to the border standoff. We've seen it just in the last few years. In 2013, there was the standoff at Depsang, which is also in this area. Then you had Tumar, also in Ladakh, but more to the south. 2017 again, but that was in Doklam, which is in a third country in Bhutan. 2020 back in Ladakh. So just the old question, why is it that the Chinese are refusing to demarcate the LAC or to settle the boundary dispute when, again, in 2003, Atal Behari Vajpayee, when he went to China, and the mechanism of the special representatives was set up precisely to do this?
Well, you will have to ask the Chinese that question, because I found that over the years, our side, our country, our India, has really become far more, realism-oriented when it comes to the whole issue of the boundary, about the fact that we need to maintain peace and tranquility. The idea to have these agreements on peace and tranquility and confidence building came really from the Indian side, because I remember when I was heading the East Asia division of the ministry in 1992, that's when the idea of this first border peace and tranquility agreement was born. And I'll tell you, the principle of mutual and equal security that our side keeps talking about today was, the origin of that phrase. The origin of that phrase was essentially something we learned from our discussions with the Russians, because the Russians and the Chinese were sitting down to discuss their boundary and to settle it and to ensure that there was peace and tranquility there, because they, also had skirmishes and violence on that border. So this principle of mutual and equal security really came out of that, and it became applied to the India-China context as far as these agreements, these understandings were concerned. So we were the ones who proposed to China that, look, I remember sitting down with the Chinese ambassador in Delhi at that time and, exchanging the first drafts of that agreement. This was in the summer of 1992. So the principle of mutual and equal security, I think it's a very fairly enunciated, very well enunciated principle. And it really means that from both sides, you have security interests. Each side has their legitimate security interests. But keeping that in mind and without prejudice to the claims of either side, let us understand where the pockets of difference are to begin with. Let's have a mutually drawn line of actual control between the two sides, which delineate the pockets of difference also, so that you know where the patrolling is bound to run into trouble, right, where perhaps need some kind of zone of disengagement, so that, each side knows, there, if you go, there's going to be problems. So we need to wait till a border settlement to see this thing finally settled. So that's really how a border settlement, given, the very protracted nature of the problem and the fact that decades have passed and we haven't sorted this out, I think it would really make for concrete progress if India and China were to sit down and say, okay, now we at least have a mutually agreed line of actual control between the two sides, and now let's sit down to discussing what a border settlement should look like.
So absolutely the last question, and I'll let you go after this. Again, there have been reports that one of the reasons for this particular standoff in the Galwan Valley was that India has been building roads or improving its border infrastructure right up to the line of actual control, just perhaps a few kilometers short of that. And that's something that surprised the Chinese and, something that they didn't like. So this was one way to sort of tell you to step back.
Well, we've been improving our infrastructure along the line of actual control for some years now. In fact, these were proposals, these were ideas that had been in the making and in operation and in implementation for more than a decade and a half, really, the need to improve infrastructure. So it's true that the improvement of infrastructure enables our patrols to visit these areas much more frequently. And what about the Chinese? I mean, the Chinese have done the same thing. And as they say, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander also. And so from both sides, they, operational alertness or operational activism, let's put it that way, or just frequency of visits have become much more in evidence, more than they were in the past. So what I think it really points to, without attributing reasons to this, because there may be many more reasons that we can enumerate here, but the fact is that the more you have this kind of increased patrolling, and that each side says, this is our side of the line of actual control. Oh, this is an area where we have not been able to enforce our presence. You'll have more and more of these occurrences in the future. And that is why I think an earnest appeal to the Chinese should be that, look, let's stop all this kind of aggressive rhetoric and all this media sort of fire plays and fire displays that go on. Let us sit down and like grown-up countries, sit down and exchange the maps and understand where these problems are happening, so that once we diffuse these tensions and the situation becomes more calm and rested, then, the special representatives can move on to discussing what the contours of a border settlement should be. Now, India would like a border settlement, obviously, that's comprehensive, that covers all sectors. In fact, the 2005 guiding principles mentioned that. So So we'll have, but obviously we'll have to start sector by sector.
Yeah.
Looking at the negotiations will have to go sector by sector, although ultimately they can be announced all together. Whatever settlement we have in each sector should be announced as one comprehensive boundary settlement. And I hope we can reach that goal because, keeping this alive for so long and keeping this festering and lingering for so long will do neither country any good.
So, like you said, two grown-up countries, two big powers in Asia should sit down and talk to each other. Ms. Rao, thank you so much for your time. I know that you have a book coming up on exactly this subject. So we are looking forward to reading the book, to hearing what you have to say. You have an insider's knowledge of this. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate this. Thank you again. And please continue to watch our channel, our YouTube channel, and read us at ThePrint. Thank you.
Thank you, Jyoti. Wonderful to be talking to you and at ThePrint, which I read very often. And thank you for your good wishes. All the best to you.